Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first thank the Japanese Wildlife Conservation Society for having me here and all of you for attending this symposium. So for the next hour or so, I'd like to tell you a story about sharks, fisheries, and their future. Many of you might already know this, but a few years ago, scientists issued a warning to humanity about the status of the environment. They basically said that we are in the Anthropocene, a world where human activity has become the dominant influence on the environment and climate. They talk about the sixth extinction event and how there's a crisis and that time is running out. There's no doubt that we have left our footprint on the environment, and overall the outlook is actually quite scary for many species. Of the animal species that have been assessed by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, 19.7% are considered to be threatened with extinction. That means that they're critically endangered, or vulnerable. From the shark perspective, in 2014, a study estimated that up to 25% of shark species had also an elevated risk of extinction, so also critically endangered, or vulnerable. What I'd like to start with is give you some key background information on sharks and why they're in this situation. Firstly, I have used and I will continue to use the term shark today, but I am referring to sharks and rays. So what are they? So often, when we think about shark, we think back about the movies Jaws, at least in my culture, and I did for a very long time. But the reality of it is what we call sharks is actually a very large and diverse group of species. They form part of a group that's called the elasmobranchs, so they're fish. And around the world, there are over 1,200 species of sharks, of which there are about 503 species of what I call the real sharks, and then another over almost 700 species of what we call rays. And they come in all shapes and sizes, they have different behaviors, and they utilize various marine habitats from freshwater, estuaries, coastal areas, and even the high seas. And over the past 20 years, we've increased the number of shark species we actually know about. And this is because there's an increasing focus on sharks in particular, but also because of advances in the fields of taxonomy and particularly genetics, where we don't just look at what a species looks like, so not just morphology, but we more and more depend on genetic information to be able to delineate between species. And the key difference between sharks and rays is that sharks have gills on the side of the body, whereas the rays have them when you turn them, so on the underside of the body. And while they are fish, they're a different kind of fish. A fish like a grouper or a snapper, for example, might release up to 5 million eggs in the water at the same time, whereas a shark will give birth to anything between 1 and 300 pups, and it's live birth. A fish can have a lifespan of up to 30 years, whereas a shark can have a lifespan of up to 300 years. Fish usually mature early, so they can reproduce multiple times a year, and they can have a gestation period of just a few days. But for sharks, they're often late to mature. That means that sometimes only after 20 years or longer. And they sometimes reproduce only once a year, and they can have gestation periods of up to 2 years. These differences are really very important because when shark populations are overexploited, it could take them decades to actually recover, if at all, even after very strict protection measures are put in place. To add to this, if you look at the 200-meter depth here, so if we're looking at species that are in deeper waters, sharks that occur there are even more susceptible to fishing pressures, and they have even lower growth rate, a larger age of maturity, higher longevity, and smaller litters. With fisheries expanding into deeper waters, we're now also targeting many of these deep water species. And just to give you a few examples of some sharks that I think are cool, the whale shark is the biggest fish in the ocean. It can reach up to 18 meters in length or more. And they usually aggregate as subadults in certain regions of the world, like, for example, in Mexico or Western Australia. However, even though it is the largest fish in the water, we still can count the number of pregnant females that we have actually recorded, and we still don't know where they actually give birth. Devil rays can dive down to 2 kilometers very quickly. Females usually give birth to a single pup every 2 years, and after a gestation period of 2 years. So ladies here, imagine being pregnant for 2 years and the type of maternal investment that it requires. The Greenland shark is the world's oldest vertebrate. Based on radiocarbon testing of the islands, scientists calculated a lifespan of at least 272 and up to 512 years. With these numbers, females would only reach maturity after 150 years in the wild. That would mean navigating around fishing vessels to make sure you stay alive for 150 years before you can even have a pup and start regenerating a population. There are many studies that suggest that if we remove sharks from the marine environment as top predators, the food chain would collapse. We don't have all of these details yet, but what I can say, however, and that's just common sense, if you have a pyramid, no matter whether it's animal or human, once one component becomes loose or falls, then the situation gets shaky before it quickly tumbles. The diversity among sharks is actually really incredible, and there's always something new and exciting to learn about them. But the reality of the situation is that we are at the stage where the pyramid is swaying, and we need to be taking action. And so the question is, what is actually happening to sharks, and why are we, as scientists, concerned? In the 1990s, shocking figures came out of the scientific community. Some species had seen population declines of up to 90%. Based on the numbers of shark fins that were found in entrepôts, so in warehouses in Hong Kong, they estimated that up to 73 million sharks were being killed every year. Some of the work that was done, as I mentioned earlier, by the IUCN showed that up to 25% of species were threatened with extinction. And all of this was because there was international demand for shark fins and meat, but also because they were either targeted or caught as bycatch in many fisheries around the world. And sharks face many threats, from coastal development, sea filling or reclamation of large areas, desalination plants, and pollution from various sources. There's no doubt that these human activities are impacting sharks, like other species, from the quality of their habitats, potential nursery grounds, so areas where sharks come back to give birth, and movement, and so on. But the real problem is that sharks are collateral damage. They are most threatened by fisheries. They're caught in all types of gears, whether it's artisanal fisheries, so small-scale fisheries in gill nets or beach things. They're caught in long lines. They're caught in even seemingly unharmful small fishing traps. And you may also have read reports about how many of our oceans are already overfished, and the growing issue of overcapacity, where there are too many boats that are out there fishing at the same time. And just to show you some pictures I've taken at various sites I've worked at, and this happens every day at hundreds of thousands of fish landing sites around the world. So imagine the scale of the exploitation. This map shows you some of the key countries that have reported large quantities of shark landings from 2002 to 2015. Indonesia has ranked #1 in terms of the quantities reported, followed by India, by Spain, and by Taiwan. But you'll see here that Japan also reports large quantities of sharks every year. And while sharks are often consumed locally by coastal communities, so this is a picture from India, for a long time the key driver in their exploitation was their fins. In fact, the primary shark product traded are the fins around the world. And this is because in many Asian countries, in particular China, there has long been a tradition of consuming shark fin soup. This is an X-ray of a shark fin, and the bottom part here shows the cartilage, so this is not consumed. But if you can see here, there's a lot of these fin needles called the ceratotrichia, and these are used in the soup. And the larger the fin, the more fin needles it has, and therefore is more expensive. Depending on which species the fin belongs to, the more expensive the soup can be, and some people pay hundreds of dollars for one bowl. So for example, wedge fishes, these animals here, which are actually a type of ray, have very large and tall fins, and are considered to be the highest value fins now. Stan, who you'll hear from right after my talk, investigated some of the trade markets in Hong Kong and found that 1 kilo of dried fins could fetch more than $900 US. They call them the king of shark fins. And generally, for all shark species, even though all fins are used, there are primary fins that are more expensive and that have the highest concentration of fin needles. So you can see here in yellow the first dorsal fin, the pectoral fin, so a pair, one on each side, and the lower part of the tail. And these primary fins have the highest value, but I need to say that all fins for juveniles and adults are being used. Generally in fisheries, the fins are removed from the sharks and then they're dried before being packed for exports, and then they're sold to Asia. So once they get to Asia, they're usually processed where the skin is removed and then sold for shark fin soup. Again, Stan will give you a nice overview of the trade and what's been happening for the past few decades, but it's important to note that fins are not the only products that are traded. As I mentioned earlier, the meat is also used for local consumption or is traded. For example, the mako shark that you see here is known for its very high quality meat that is often used for sashimi. And in the past, in many fisheries, sharks were often finned. So the fins were removed and the sharks were thrown back in the water to die, like in this picture. But over the last decade, the trade in meat has increased by over 150%, and there's now a growing market for this product globally. As you can see here, for some of the meat trade that's been documented, it's really worldwide. Brazil is very famous for it. There's some areas here in Asia as well, but it is a global phenomenon. And it's a growing issue that we need to be able to understand and start addressing. And finally, there's also trade in the gill plates of certain species like mantas odeverays. These are gill plates here, which are parts of when you remove the gills on the side of the body. This is used as tonic in Chinese medicine. Their skin of many species is used as leather. The jaws of large species are used in collections or as souvenirs. And also the liver oil that can be used to extract vitamin A supplements or even to make beauty products. And if I go back to this slide, with all the fisheries and the trade data that we have collected over the years, we know that many species have seen large declines in their numbers. We know this because we take all of the data that is available from governments and scientists, and we evaluate the status of species. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into the details of all the methods that can be used to assess the status of a species. So one standardized and recognized approach is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And we look at the likelihood that a species will go extinct. So just to illustrate a simplified example here with sawfishes that are considered critically endangered, if we assume that we have a population of 10 sawfishes in the wild, and we know this because we have studies that have shown this, we look at how many of this population have disappeared in 10 years, or what we call 3 generation lengths. Again, I won't go into the details, but for this species, it's 45 years. So if we find that after 45 years of surveying, we only have 2 animals that are left in the wild, then we consider that it's an 80% decline, and this species has an extremely high risk of extinction, so it's critically endangered. We know that sawfishes used to exist along the coast of 78 countries around the world, so all the countries that are in blue here. Recent work shows that they now occur only in 36 countries. So again, the countries that are here in blue. The ones that are in orange are the ones that have lost at least one species of sawfish. There are many local extinctions, and in many areas of the Indian Ocean, so around here, we know that they still occur, but we maybe have 1 or 2 sawfishes that are recorded every year. And we have regions of the world where species have been assessed at the regional level, and where the situation is even worse. So these regional assessments have not been done around everywhere, but in the Mediterranean Sea and the Northwest Indian Ocean, we have 50% of species that occur there that are considered to be threatened with extinction, compared to the 25% globally. And that is a scary situation. So what can be done? Awareness and education campaigns on the status of sharks and how people and communities can contribute to their conservation have been led by hundreds of non-governmental organizations around the world, including campaigns to change consumption patterns in Asia. These have had major impacts, with airlines no longer transporting fins in their cargo, shark fin soup no longer being served on menus at weddings, and how sharks are actually now being perceived by the general community. Others are highlighting that how sharks are worth much more alive than dead, with shark ecotourism having the potential to bring in millions of dollars to many countries. It's now estimated to bring about $300 million, but it's projected to increase to almost $800 million in the next 20 years. Divers from around the world, including myself, dream of encountering sharks underwater, from diving in the Bahamas with tiger sharks, or even around Honshu Island in Japan. At the government level, there are many schemes where countries have set up what we call marine protected areas, or even shark sanctuaries, where they protect certain species and ban fishing in certain areas. Now, these are great, and they also protect other species of fish and habitats like coral reefs and seagrass. But the problem with sharks is that they move, and they can move large distances, over thousands of kilometers, in a very short amount of time. So even if you have one protected area which is well monitored and has good levels of enforcement, as soon as sharks move into a different region, they're once again threatened by fisheries. There are also regional fisheries bodies that are set up around the world. Japan is a party to many of these because Japanese fleets operate in many parts of the world. They've generally been set up to ensure the sustainable management of tuna and tuna-like species. And even though sharks are increasingly on the agenda, they're not the main species these bodies are mandated to manage, and they often only focus on pelagic species that interact with tuna fisheries. So these account for less than 5% of the 1,200 species of sharks that exist around the world. So as such, they don't provide adequate coverage of species. Other instruments also exist to try and manage certain species of sharks. So these include the United Nations Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on Migratory Species Sharks Memorandum of Understanding, and CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. Only 2 of these, CMS and CITES, are actually legally binding, and they address somewhat different management aspects. Each of them has appendices on which various species are listed. CMS focuses broadly on the national protection of certain species, and if they're listed in Appendix 1, it means that countries should protect them, and they should promote collaboration between different parties to improve the status of a species. CITES focuses specifically on trade aspects and how to control the trade to ensure that it is legal, traceable, and sustainable. And I'll mostly focus on giving you information about CITES and the efforts that have been ongoing to try and regulate the trade in sharks. So CITES is an important global convention that was adopted in 1975. It's got 183 parties that you can see here on the map in red, and it accords some form of trade protection to over 35,000 marine and terrestrial species. Species on CITES can be listed into 3 different appendices. Appendix 1 is for species that are threatened with extinction, so they might or might not be affected by the trade. International commercial trade in Appendix 1 species is prohibited. This is the case for all 5 species of sawfishes, as I mentioned earlier. Any commercial trade in their products is completely banned. There's still some trade for aquaria under certain conditions. Appendix 2 is for species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but they may become so unless the trade is regulated. Species that are listed on Appendix 2 are allowed to be traded, but this is regulated through a permitting process. So countries need to be able to show that the trade is not detrimental to the species in the wild. Most species of sharks and rays are listed on Appendix 2. And lastly, Appendix 3 species are species for which a country is asking for other parties to CITES to help with its protection. Species are proposed for listing on CITES because we know that the trade is a key driver behind their exploitation and that it needs to be controlled. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here. The family of mantas and devil rays consists of 11 species that occur globally in temperate and tropical waters. There are targeted fisheries in many countries for these species, but landings in Sri Lanka, in India, and in Indonesia are very high, and they're driven by the trade in their gill plates. As I mentioned earlier, rays have gills on the underside of their bodies. Mantas and devil rays mostly are filter feeders, and they extract plankton from the water. They have a different structure to their gills than other species of rays. And these special gill plates are particularly in demand in Chinese traditional medicine. So these gill plates are removed from the dead animals, they're dried as seen here, and they're crushed to make tonic. Populations of these species have declined in a very short amount of time, and for us this is very concerning. If you remember earlier, I showed you this picture. These animals only give birth to 1 pup every 2 years and have a gestation period of 2 years. The same feature that actually makes these animals so fascinating is also what is driving them to extinction, because they simply cannot withstand the fishing pressure that they're facing. Similarly, the rhino rays, so 16 species of wedgefishes and giant guitarfishes, were proposed earlier this year for listing on CITES. I spoke briefly about the very high value of their fins earlier. So these rhino rays were recently declared to be the most threatened marine group in the world. We have data from different parts of the world showing declines of over 80 and 99% in their populations in the Indo-Pacific. Of these 16 species, only 1 species is not critically endangered. It's near threatened. And this is just because it only occurs around here in northern Australia, and so it benefits from the protection that they have in place at the national level. So these declines have largely happened because these species usually occur in very shallow coastal areas where the impact of fisheries is intense and they basically have no refuge. With the high value of their fins as a driver to retain them in these fisheries, they basically have very little chance to survive unless the trade is somehow regulated. So you might wonder what species are actually listed on CITES. The process of listing shark species on CITES was literally very, very slow for a long time, but we've seen tremendous change in the past few years. Initially, in the late 1990s, with growing concern of the status of many shark species, especially from the trade, countries like the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland asked for support in the year 2000 to list the basking shark on Appendix 3. Australia in 2001 did the same thing for the great white shark. But it's not till 2004 that the first species of shark was listed on Appendix 2 of the convention, the great white shark. This meant that all parties now needed to implement these listings and ensure that they had permits to trade in the species, and that this was done in a way that is not detrimental for them in the wild. CITES convention meetings take place every 3 years, and just to show you the progress since, as I mentioned, the great white shark was listed in 2004. In 2007, all the species of sawfishes were listed on Appendix 1. In 2010, even though there were proposals for sharks and rays, none of the species was listed. And then since 2013 up to earlier this year in Geneva last month, not all proposals have been accepted for listings, but you see 15 species in 2016 and 18 species this year. So all of these are now on Appendix 2, so again, the trade is allowed, but it needs to be regulated. This means that there are now 46 species of sharks and rays on CITES. There's a lot to do when it comes to implementation in the coming years to ensure that the trade in these species is actually sustainable. And if you remember, I mentioned that it takes a long time for sharks to recover, even after strict protection. So it will take some time before we're actually likely to see a difference from these trade measures. But it is a great first step. Finally, before I end this talk, I was asked to quickly present a summary on the type of work that I do through my project, the Elasma project. So it's a project that started off very small when I was working on my PhD in the United Arab Emirates, and it has really expanded over the years. So I now work with other scientists globally and have students in 8 countries currently working on 14 projects. All of these projects have one thing in common, is we're looking at sharks and rays, and we're trying to gather data so that we can inform policy and help implement decisions like CITES, for example. But we mainly work at landing sites, so monitoring them at all times of days, even in very remote locations. We collect data on quantities that are being landed, we identify species and we measure them. We collect biological information such as sex and maturity, and we collect genetic samples for future analysis. This allows us to have data on trends over time, understand the biology of species, determine if stocks are shared between different countries, and also evaluate the impact that a fishery is having on a species. We always try and work with fisher communities, so I believe that there are eyes on the sea, and we will never be able to accumulate as much knowledge as they have in their lifetimes and over the course of the project. So this engagement is usually through informal discussions, presentations, and more frequently one-on-one interviews. These 2 pictures are from 2 researchers we're working with from the Blue Resources Trust in Sri Lanka, but it's even more important because we want to train the next generation of local scientists. So it's really important to be able to collaborate with local organizations in the different countries. So they're now interviewing fishermen in Sri Lanka to better understand what's happening with the wedge fishes and giant guitar fishes. And then finally, all this accumulated data needs to be put into use. So I've participated in many workshops around the world to train fisheries and customs officials on how to identify species at landing sites, but also how to be able to implement CITES listings, and have developed tools for the identification of species in the accurate local languages, but also to be able to work on CITES implementation issues. So just to end this, I want to say that I've not done this alone, and it wouldn't have been possible with so many people fantastic people that I've worked with, and the organizations that have provided support. And there are some incredible people that are working on sharks around the world. Stan, who's going to talk now, is one of them and doing some fantastic work. And it's been a tremendous effort to try and protect sharks in the past decade. And governments are finally interested in making a difference and taking the right steps. So I don't know if it's too late for some species, but I'm convinced that at least if we continue with our efforts, we will make sure that extinction is not an option. That's it. Thank you. Arigato gozaimasu.